Thank you very much. Thanks, Catherine. Thank you very much for having me. It was great to be here. I did want to just underscore a couple of things that Catherine said, other than the fact that pizza drives innovation in Waterloo Region. But her point about reaching out to members of the legislature and the General Assembly is really, really, really important. These big, bold investments that your governor has made, they are difficult. They're not retail politics. They're long-term bets, and they need the air cover to enable or to ensure that they can sustain them over time. And so it's really important that each and every one of you take it personally that you really need to support what's been launched and support Catherine, because otherwise these things can be, written off very, very quickly as not being successful. So anyway, thank you very much for having me. If there's questions along the way, please feel free to kind of shout out if you disagree, which I'm going to count on Tim to do. Then please feel free to do so and try and make this fairly informal. I do have a bunch of slides I'm going to whip through very, very quickly, and then hopefully we can get some dialogue, because I'm always much more interested in answering the questions that you have than trying to imagine what the questions are that I didn't think of answering before. I was going to make the title of this presentation Grow Your Own, but I was edited last night, so I removed the slide. And really what I mean by grow your own is that much of what you're going to see in what I'm going to talk about today is a story about a community that came together to grow their own economy. And you'll hopefully have a better sense of what I'm talking about by the time I get through this. Catherine talked about being in the back of the quartile. Catherine is a runner. I told her that it's great. There's nothing better than passing people when you're running, and I fully expect that this state is going to pass a lot of people over the next little while, because you've got such tremendous assets in this community that the rest of us are so envious of. You've got oceans and beautiful towns and great cities and world-leading, the best, not among the best, but the best universities in the world. And so you've got such tremendous assets, and I just think that there's nothing, this is going to be the great story for the Yale Management School case study in the future as to how this community came together to reinvent itself and to grow its own economy. In Waterloo Region, we also like to be the underdog. I can't remember whether it was Hertz or Avis said, we try harder. Because we're number 2, and basically what we said is that we knew that Silicon Valley is Silicon Valley, and they're number 1. They got about a 60-year head start on the rest of us, but number 2 is pretty much wide open, and we've seen New York City make a major play for that in the last little while, which is absolutely remarkable what they've done in a very, very short period of time. And so our target is really to be the second best place to start and grow a technology company on the planet, because it does make us try harder, it does make us leaner. This is our premier, equivalent of the governor, who made this faux pas in claiming that Waterloo Region is Canada's most important technology community. Then he had to go back to Toronto and explain to all the people in Toronto why Waterloo Region was the most important tech cluster in the region. But when he talked about things, he really focused on what we do well and what has made us successful. And yes, it's a lot of the the kind of the hard stuff and the technology and the engineering and the science. But really, I think that what we've learned is that it's the soft stuff that really makes a difference. And so hence the reason that I'm so encouraged by the potential that you've got in the fact that you're all here together and willing to pull together and work together. But we really do tend to focus on these aspects, and I'll talk a bit about some of them: the notion of collaborative capitalism, the ecosystem, intentionality, which I will also speak of, and real partnerships. I think that often we use the word partner and we don't really mean it. We mean it until we get out of the room, and then we're going to go and do whatever the frig we want to do. So that's key, and I'll try and touch on that. And then, of course, the last one is jurisdictional competitiveness. I think, really one of the secrets in being successful is you can't view each other as being competitors. It's not about, the startup alley versus this startup, ghetto in, one city versus another. It's really about you all coming together to gang up to take on the world. Because it's other jurisdictions, whether it's Massachusetts that's stealing all your top talent, or whether it's China that's stealing all the great jobs, Really it is about you pulling together to take on the world. And so we spend a lot of time focused on this notion of jurisdictional competitiveness, and what I mean by that is we look very carefully at what everyone else is doing, we steal what's best, and we respond to competitive threats. So a long time ago, well, not really. Anyway, so Waterloo Region, just to give you a sense of what the community is we're about an hour due west of Toronto. Toronto is the 4th largest metro in North America. It's always battling with Philadelphia and Houston as to who's number 4, but the first 3 are obvious, New York, LA, and Chicago. So it's a major metro. It's big. It's over 5 million people. We're a little bit west of that. Our community was the 2nd largest manufacturing community in Canada per capita. A long history of metal bashing, of different kinds of industries such as food processing, liquor, but very much an industrial manufacturing community. And it really, in many respects, there's a lot of similarities between ourselves and yours as to how, where you're starting from and where you're coming from and what is core. I think what's important is to recognize the fact that, don't look at who you were and who you are right now as being negative. They are the assets that will allow you to build the kind of economy in the future. So when I talked about the notion of intentionality, that's exactly what I was talking about, is the notion of being able to engineer the kind of economy that you want for the future. Stephen Hawking, anyone not know who Stephen Hawking is? Anyone willing to admit they don't know who Stephen Hawking is? All right, we're going to move on. So Stephen Hawking, of course, wrote a book called The Brief History of Time. He's probably the most famous living physicist. He also has decided to come and hang around in Waterloo Region, which was pretty damn cool. I had a chance to meet him. Anyway, the notion of a brief history of time, I don't think that if you're trying to build a strong technology-based economy that it needs to take you the 15 years that it took us. But as you can see, over a very short period of time, we moved from about $100 million in total revenue to over $30 billion. 30,000 jobs were created. Now, the beauty of all of this, of course, is when we began this exercise 15 years ago, there were no models. Nobody was talking about ecosystems. Nobody was talking about entrepreneurs. That was a dirty word. That was a default. If you couldn't get a real job, you became an entrepreneur. And I think that much has changed, and the opportunities are that much bigger and that much sooner than what we went through in our community. Now, people often ask, how has Waterloo Region been able to pull this together? And there's a couple of things I'll talk to. One of which is this notion of pulling together. It is absolutely critical that people work together. We often talk about, it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a community to grow a great technology company. It really is incumbent on each and every one of us in this room to say, hold up our hands and say, you know what, we pledge, we're going to work together. We're going to make it intuitive for entrepreneurs to find the right programs and services. We're going to make sure that we're not competing. We're going to make sure there's not overlap and duplication between the programs we're running. We're going to set our egos aside. We're going to set our egos aside for the benefit of trying to support more and more successful technology companies. So this notion of pulling together is something that's been very, very important for us in being able to achieve the kind of results we've seen. The other thing we talk a lot about in our community, and again, looking back or hearkening back to what made us successful. Waterloo Region is about 350,000 people. We were founded by Mennonites and middle-class Germans. And so the Mennonites came, you guys had a bit of a kerfuffle down here, and William Penn had invited some people over and they didn't want to hang around for that. So they came up north. They also went south. There are Mexican Mennonites as well. But they came to our community, and the interesting thing about our community is because it was settled by Mennonites and working-class Germans, tool and die makers, etc., was that it was a classless society. And so this bit about being able to work together is something that we have had as a long-term competitive advantage. And so when you think about the assets you have in your community, don't just think about things such as capital and world-leading research in microbiology. Think about some of the things that have made you successful in the past, because they are what is going to differentiate you and make you successful in the future. And in our case, we leaned heavily on the tradition and the culture of who we were. We didn't try to be Silicon Valley. There aren't any Mennonites in Silicon Valley. We just tried to focus on what is it that we've got as assets that we can use to build the kind of economy that we want for the future. And that is a Mennonite barn raising, in case anyone's wondering. So a friend of mine, he lives next door to a Mennonite farm, and so he just moved to town. He bought this farm called Chatterbox Farm because his wife liked the name Chatterbox Farm. And and he went to his neighbor, and he was standing over the fence, and he was talking to his neighbor. I think his name was Ezekiel, or I don't know what his name was. But anyway, he's talking to his neighbor, and he says, you know, I'm thinking about getting insurance for my barn. And he says, you know, which insurance and how much insurance do you have? And the neighbor said, well, we don't have insurance. And so my friend said, well, what happens if your barn burns down? And he said, well, you know, the community comes together and builds the barn again. And that really is the reality of the kind of community and the kind of history that we have in Waterloo. The other thing that we've got, and I think you have it here too, is when we set out to say that we wanted to be the entrepreneurial capital of Canada, we weren't. And we made that claim based on the history of who we were, not who we were at that point in time. And so we do have a very strong entrepreneurial history. You know, whiskey and buttons and rubber boots and sausage and all cookies and barbecues and, you know, grub shoes and, you know, you name it. These are people throughout our history who have said, you know what, I've got a big idea, I see a market opportunity, I'm going to bet the farm and go for it. And so, you know, as we tried to raise the profile and convince people that they should think about doing a startup, you know, we really looked backwards to who we were, and we celebrated those people who had come before and said, this is ours to take. We already are an incredibly entrepreneurial community, and we've got proof right here. So the piece around entrepreneurialism, there's lots of great communities. Pittsburgh is the one I always like to pick on as a great example of, you know, a community that was incredibly entrepreneurial, and somehow at some point in time it became more in vogue to go and work at Mellon Bank than to be the next Mellon. And so really what you've got to do is you've got to try and unearth that and reposition it as being cool once again. Forced innovation, you know, very simply put, we were a community that was not built on a major transportation route, and so we were forced over our history to try and figure out how to do things for ourselves. We had to look to each other to reinvent ourselves over history as, you know, structural and economic changes occurred. I think the final thing that's unique about our community and helps explain who we are and why we've managed to have the success we've had is this notion of moonshots. We're not afraid to make big outlandish claims. You know, when we said 15 years ago that we wanted to be the second best place on the planet to start and grow a great technology build a technology company, I mean, people laughed. And so, you know, the other one thing that we're not willing to do is we're not willing to make big objectives, to set big targets, and we're also not afraid to fail. I mean, we're going to do everything we possibly can not to, but I mean, I think that's the other really important thing in understanding our area. So all that being said, you know, at this time 15 years ago, the kind of dominant economic development strategy was this notion of buffalo hunting, which I'm stealing from Carol Coletta here. But the notion is that, you know, if you wanted to increase employment in your community, in your jurisdiction, you went out and you encouraged somebody to come to your area, and they would hire a bunch of people, and everybody would live happily ever after. And I think that what happened was people increasingly were saying that that was difficult, that was problematic, and that should not be the dominant economic strategy. And so it was at that point in time that a group of, these are our founding fathers, in case you're wondering. I wonder if this is in Connecticut. Never mind. But it was at that point in time that a group of 15 young upstarts who were all starting and running relatively insignificant companies came together and said, you know what, we're gonna do something different. We're going to band together to build the second best place on the planet to start and grow a great technology company. And it was that commitment at the time to focus on some key areas which, interestingly enough, are still areas which we're still working on 15 years later. But probably the dominant one was there's lots of people who are paying attention to the science. You've got, you know, investments in research, you've got investments in science, you've got science strategies, you've got a chief scientist reporting to the Prime Minister of Canada. Everybody follows the science. We're going to back the entrepreneur. We're going to say that there are enough people and enough institutions out there paying attention to the science and the technology, and what we're going to do is we're going to try and encourage every man, woman, and child in Waterloo region to think about being an entrepreneur, to want to be an entrepreneur as much as they want to be a hockey player, And then when they decide to pull the trigger and go for it, we're going to throw everything we possibly can at them to help them be successful. And that's basically what we do. I mean, there's a whole bunch of other things that we do, programs and services and events and activities and pizza and everything else, but at the core of it is we back the entrepreneur. We believe they're the catalyst. If you do the pathology on most of the major technology companies, it was always a story about somebody in fourth-year university or working on a graduate project who, was exposed to something, had an idea, and figured out that they were going to go for it. Or they were disgruntled working at a bank or an insurance company that had a big idea as to how they could sell back into that company, and they went for it. But it always is about the entrepreneur as the catalyst for taking the great knowledge and the great research that we do and transforming it into wealth creation, prosperity for the jurisdiction and the community. The other thing that's occurred is this notion that we've been working on is that we feel we really need to adapt and to evolve to make sure that we're doing everything we possibly can to support tech companies. And so that means constantly asking ourselves, what else can we possibly do? What else can we possibly do? What are they doing in Mountain View that we need to respond to or we need to steal? But the notion of evolution and staying current, not becoming satisfied with, well, we have a startup weekend, so why would we do a Hacker Fest? But really making sure that we're constantly saying, is there something new that we need to be responding to? Is there something different we need to be doing? We talk a lot about this notion of an ecosystem approach, and I think that when we talk about ecosystem, really what we're saying is that it's not a linear model. It's a model whereby everyone plays an important role, but that the roles have to be connected and the people within the system have to be committed to each other and to a common goal. And I know it's a great metaphor. I'm not sure it's an actual functioning model, but it's a great metaphor for what we need to do as individuals and contributors to making sure that we're building great technology companies. And it does involve all the players. It does involve the role of the academic institutions, professional service firms. Government is a key partner in all of this. But it, again, is that notion of, everybody plays an important role, everyone matters, but things need to be connected and people need to be working together. And that's a really poor attempt at us trying to understand what our ecosystem is all about. But the net of this is, as you'll see, is we put the tech company and we put the entrepreneur at the center. Brad Feld, who I have great respect for and who's done a lot of work at not just building Boulder into a major startup community, but also really trying to share what he knows with everyone across North America, he speaks about these things. And he talks about the need for there to be, founders and feeders. And that one isn't more important than the other, but, the founders are the ones that are really the focus of what we're trying to do. The founders are the ones that need to be central to building a successful ecosystem. And the feeders all play critical roles, but you can't have a bunch of university presidents and lawyers and accountants running an entrepreneurial center because they just are not equipped to be able to respond to the needs of the founders. I don't know if this is offend people or not, but whatever. I'm leaving tomorrow. I don't care. The other thing we talk about is really the fact that going back to this notion of it's about the entrepreneur. And of course, quoting Bill Clinton is one of my favorite things to do. He didn't say this, but he said something similar, and I think it's really important. It's really if you make sure that it comes down to putting the entrepreneur at the center, then you're not going to be anything but successful. And just because I was on a president's search, I thought, well, why not? I mean, the other thing we talk about in our community is for, by, and of, or actually it's of, by, and for, I think. But it is, for the entrepreneur, by the entrepreneur, of the entrepreneur. That is the focus of what we do. And you can see that, you might think that, gee, he's going overboard and he's kind of goofy. But, the point is that you just can't emphasize this stuff enough, because there is a natural default to other models. There is a natural default to, geez, let's just put some yet more money into, the science center or academic research, and of course it's going to translate into remarkable things. It's not. It's not going to happen. It's going to not produce the kind of results you're going to want to see. And as we've seen in Canada, And I don't know what your situation is like here, but I mean, we find that a lot of our major investments into R&D at world-leading research institutions benefit the French and people in New Jersey. And so that's the reason why we do have such a fine point on this issue around really focusing on the founder, growing your own economy, building a major tech cluster one company at a time. I think the other things that's important to keep in mind is it's a life cycle approach. We were talking a bit about capital last night, and it's not just about, you know, $2 to $5 million VC. It's about what are the issues that companies face at every stage? Because when you're just starting out, you know, 5 or 25 or 50K can make or break your business. And so really making sure that we have a life cycle focus on what we do is critical. The other thing we have is a philosophy which we call no company left behind. So we'll work with, you know, once we've kind of whipped the community into a frenzy about being an entrepreneur, and we focus them on trying to do problem finding as opposed to problem solving, and they decide they're going to do a startup, of course, when they walk through our doors, we don't filter them. We don't say good idea, bad idea, good idea, bad idea. We make sure that we help every company work through, because I mean, at the end of the day, if it's truly disruptive, there is no market sizing for it. And you never know, because companies are going to pivot quickly. So they might walk in saying, I'm going to disrupt the personal training industry, and discover, well, that's really not going to happen. But there is a big opportunity as far as having a, you know, SaaS-based system to you know, be the back office for every gym in the world. So, you know, the notion that ideas are never what they start out as, usually products and markets aren't what they start out at, really means that for us, it's really important that we make sure we bring everyone along. We're not filtering at intake. The other thing that's important in our beliefs is that it really is a numbers game. So, you know, anyone who's done sales, you'll recognize this notion of a sales funnel, and it really translates into, you know, if you want to have a handful of big companies, then you need to be jamming the top of the funnel with as many startups as possibly can. Or as I like to say, it's about shots on goal. That's Wayne Gretzky, playing for the Edmonton Oilers, which is where he should have stayed. But anyway, it's okay. I'm over that now. You guys had Gordie Howe playing for you, which is very cool. So, you know, it really is. So there are some people out there that say, yo, you know, you shouldn't pay so much attention to startups because it's the mid-sized, high-growth gazelles that produce all the jobs. Well, guess what? You're not going to have any mid-growth, high-growth gazelles unless you've got, you know, 50 to 100 times the number of startups. It's just not going to happen. You can't just say, boom, we're going to create a gazelle. It's not going to happen. So really what's critical is this notion of shots on goals. Jam the funnel with as many companies as possible. A certain percentage of those startups are going to graduate to being small companies. A certain percentage of those small companies are going to graduate to being mid-sized, and a certain percentage are going to graduate to being large companies. Now, yes, there's a bunch that are going to get taken out along the way, but hopefully, as Catherine was talking about, you've built the kind of place, or you've married people off to other people locally, that they're going to stay. They're going to stick around. They're going to say, you know what, like Hartford or New Haven are really cool places, and I want to stay here because I love the Yale gym. I was told there was something really cool about the Yale gym. I'm dying to see it. You know, so when they do sell their company, they're going to stick around. They're going to say, I'm going to be a repeat offender. I'm going to do it again. I'm going to do it again. I'm going to do it again. And so, you know, don't be too concerned about companies that are selling out early. It's really about a mix. We really look carefully and saying, yeah, you know, it is sad that PostRank sold to Google. That is a sad one for our community because it could have been huge, and it wasn't huge because they couldn't raise the next round of venture capital. But most of the time, there's other reasons why people sell. And the good news is the woman who was the CEO of PostRank has stuck around, and now she's building an incredible company called Exonify. And so, you know, the funnel is important. The shots and goals are important. You can't just focus and say we want we want a mid-sized company and have that as a successful strategy. It really is about more startups. I mean, the interesting thing about Waterloo Region that a lot of people don't recognize as well is, you know, while we do lots of boondoggling all over the world to try and convince people to bring their big companies to Waterloo Region, every billion-dollar company that's come to Waterloo Region in the last 20 years has come to acquire a startup. Unbeknownst to any economic development promotion organization, unbeknownst to any trade conference, fancy collateral, whatever, they've come to acquire a startup. And we've brought Google, rumored to be bringing Facebook. It hasn't been announced. You know, we brought Cisco and Sybase and SAP and Agfa and Oracle and Adobe. They've all come to Waterloo Region to acquire a startup, and they've stuck around. They've stuck around because when they get on the ground, you know, going back to what Catherine said, you know, they found this is a pretty cool place, and there's remarkable, extraordinary talent here that we didn't even know, and so we're going to stay and we're going to build our business here. I think one of the other things, and we just actually ran this numbers, this gives you a sense of the kind of rate of startup activity that we've had in our community. So a community of 350,000 people, 405 net new startups last year. And the other really interesting thing here is our 5-year survival rate. So we have a very high 5-year survival rate, and we think that a lot of that is the fact that we've got such a strong ecosystem that supports companies. So it's one thing to start 405 if 400 of the companies are going to die. The other, you know, really critical piece in this is the ability to be able to influence the longevity, the survivability, I don't think that's a word, survivability of the companies. I'm going to just touch on very briefly a couple of things to talk about the fact that it's working. I mentioned these numbers before. We're very proud. We're actually astonished by the success we've had in the last little while. No one imagined that we would have 405 net new startups last year. I mean, it would have been crazy for somebody to even say that. We're also been privileged to build some big companies in our community. Most of these you won't recognize, but Black Beer, of course, is one, where they have decided not to sell early. They have been able to take the company and build it into a global brand and take it public. Lots of startups. We're also, as I mentioned, attracting a lot of great companies to our area because of the great startups. And as I say, most of these are staying. Yes? And the other thing, of course, that, you know, really is the mine for the future is the fact that we do have great academic institutions. We have in our community about 100,000 students. So we are a major education cluster, and this really bodes well and gives us long-term anchor for our success of our community. Now, very quickly on this notion of doing the right thing, recently we launched yet another initiative which was focused on building a center, which we also call the Hub. It's 50,000 square feet. It's unique in the fact that it not only has got 100 startups in it, but we also have got 11 large strategic partners in it. So Google and BlackBerry and Intel, et cetera, all have got presence inside the Hub with the startups. And then we also have got 2 university incubators that are embedded in the Communitech Hub. So in the incubator, there's an incubator within an incubator. And that's really important because what it does is it's a beacon for people on campus who are doing a startup, and it gets them over the moat and off the campus and embedded in the broader ecosystem. And so we didn't plan to have university incubators embedded in our Hub. It just happened, and we just saw the opportunity and said yes and went for it. But it really is one of the ingredients that has made this latest initiative so successful. And I'll talk a bit about success in a minute. I mean, the other thing, too, is just, you know, through these kinds of focused investments and activities, really have put ourselves on the map. So when we set out with this latest strategy, we said, you know, we were going to help companies raise $100 million in equity. We're at $350 million in 3 years. These are 5-year targets. So you can see that, you know, we're having significant results for the investments that we're making in this strategy. The funniest one is when we put together this deal that brought all the partners together, we said, you know, we're going to create 100 new companies in 5 years, and people were like, are you sure? You're sure you're going to be able to do that? And of course, we just recently, this past month, passed 1,000 companies. So, you know, this is, these strategies really do work, and they can work far more successfully than they've ever been able to do in the past because we've got the right ingredients in place. And just a little bit more on the kind of impact. There's a couple of numbers here. This is our 2012 impact for our organization in and of itself. So about $1 billion in economic impact. A couple of really interesting numbers here. So for every dollar that we receive in public funding, we return $4 in net new taxes. And so really what we're trying to say to government is, you know what, don't think about us as being an expense on the income statement. Think about us as being a revenue line. Because if you invest in this kind of strategy, if you invest in an entrepreneur-driven strategy, we're going to yield net new revenue for you. And I don't know if they believed it at the time, but they're certainly, you know, pleased. And the other thing about, really sort of constantly reinventing yourselves, of course, we saw a lot of our companies were going to Y Combinator and Techstars and not coming home, and that's when we launched our own accelerator. We've just been through our first cohort, we're into our second cohort now, but, the notion being that there's never one thing that's going to make this strategy successful. There's never one thing that's going to solve the problems. It's really doing everything. And then the challenge in needing to do everything, of course, is that you need a bunch of partners who don't all work for you. And so the challenge in that is making sure that people do stay connected and do stay committed to each other and are pulling together. A couple of the keys is this notion of commitment to failure. We have done some incredibly stupid things. I mean, people will say to me, well, how about a cat riding a donkey? Would that work? And I'm like, sure, let's try it. Not that it makes any sense whatsoever, but we're willing to try almost anything to get more people focused on doing a startup or to back somebody doing a startup. And we really are, we're not reckless, but we are very, very comfortable with taking risks and doing wacky things. I think the other thing is that, a lot of this stuff really isn't hard work, but it's about working well together, and it's about hard work. It's not about being really smart, it's about hard work. There's another dog sled image. I don't know if you noticed, there's actually two in my presentation. But it's important, it really is important. I think that, I work very hard, we work very hard as a community to make sure that we're pulling together, and we would not be successful if we weren't. I mean, I have the opportunity of traveling to many other locations that have far greater assets than we have in Waterloo region, where it's ugly and there's no water, there's no oceans, there's no mountains, there's no beautiful architecture. There's really no reason why you live in Waterloo region. But, we pull together and we make it a great place to live and we make it a phenomenal place to do a startup. Questions? Yes?
I imagine 15 years ago when you started this, you were, as you mentioned, one of the few kind of points of light. And now capital moves everywhere at the drop of an electron. There's incubators, you can't see it, accelerating, accelerators. So two parts of this question. One is, how important is it for a growing community like this to be perceived as something unique? And the second part is, do you see that uniqueness as part of, let's say, the natural things like the water and the mountains and whatever, as opposed to the program?
I mean, I think that our opinion is that we focus first and foremost on serving the community that we have. And so we don't focus on trying to lure people to our area. We focus on, we've got this natural advantage over anyone else for the people who are already here. And in our case, the only reason that people come to Waterloo region is they come to go to university. And so we really say, okay, how do we exploit the fact that we've got those people here temporarily? How do we get our hooks into them? How do we make them want to stay? And how do we get them involved in an entrepreneurial venture? Because the other thing about an entrepreneurial venture, when somebody starts and grows a company in your community, they put down roots, and the company and the community become intertwined, right? And it's very rare that they will pull up stakes. They'll be lured away by Ireland or Louisiana at a later date because the community is so embedded in the community, or the company is so embedded in the community. And so, really what we focus on first and foremost is exploiting the resource that we've got locally.
Can you talk more about how you build community early on?
Well, I tend to forget the things that didn't work, because that's probably human nature. But we certainly have done lots of things that didn't work. I think things that did work were, one of the things that I've learned is the power of the lure. Small amounts of money, 5, 25, 50K, can surface a lot of entrepreneurial activity that's already happening in your community that you have no knowledge of. The need for a clubhouse, a need for a place for people to go where they can just hang around and hack, a place where they feel comfortable, where they feel welcome. So it can't be a place with too many rules. I mean, we all have 2 rules at the Communitech Hub, one of which is no stealing and no sex at work. You yeah, you shouldn't drink, but we don't really care. You shouldn't sleep at work because our insurance isn't covered for that. But, you know, I mean, there's people sleeping at work every night. And so we really do spend a lot of time and put a lot of effort into making sure that people feel like they belong. And so it's not just the space and the rules, it's also about who else is there. So we really need not just sort of sage old dudes like me, although I'm not sage, I'm just old. We need young people because they're going to gravitate to the people that they consider to be authorities. And those will be people who are 22 and have had an exit already, not somebody who's 52. So, you know, that notion of really making it so that people feel comfortable that they belong, quote unquote. I think the other thing is the more convening you can do, and when I mentioned to Catherine that we serve about 10,000 pizzas a year, you know, we convene in every possible way. I mean, we've got big conferences, small conferences. We have sessions like this where it's one guy talking and everyone else listening. We've got hackathons, we've got hacker fests, we've got startup weekends, you know, we've got founders and funders events. You know, we've got sort of a whole, as Brad Feld talks about, the whole entrepreneurial stack of different ways that people can be involved and engaged and build their own networks. But again, you know, they have to be things that are authentic for the client. And there has to be... Oh.
So I have a very poorly worded question, but I have no other way to think about it. We've noticed a problem here in Connecticut where we have a lot of great sources for funding, but they're all not connected in any way. So we can't go to a startup and sort of say, well, you know, if you meet your milestones, we will continue to fund you and keep you here and keep you excited and give you a growth path here. So people will get 5,000, then 10,000, then 25,000, then maybe get sucked into Boston or elsewhere and stuff. Whereas if we just said, well, if you meet these milestones, we'll give you up to $1 million or $2 million or something, so they can put all that stuff that sucks them out of town aside and just focus on their startup. Did you guys have any similar types of things? Do you have community funding, or what's the relationship between your funding entities? Because we have silos.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, and we certainly until recently had a very similar experience where, you know, all the great companies would be, you know, invested by U.S.-based venture capital firms, and they'd set up a Delaware Corp, and they'd be in California. So that's a very real issue for us. I mean, I think there's a couple of things. I think that we have pulled together a fund where we can do, you know, sort of 150K level investments locally. It's a pledge fund that we established, and it seems to work. I think the other thing that we've done is we've worked very hard to engage the people who are potentially super angels. And so we haven't done, you know, we haven't done an initiative to say we want, you know, 1,000 angels. We've said, you know, we want 10. And these are people who have the capacity and the interest in being able to write, you know, $1 million worth of checks a year. And how do we get them engaged with what we're doing and in front of the deals? And often what we discover is, at the end of the day, you know, the best capital attraction strategy is great startups. And so, you know, the more you can put great deals in front of people who've got money, the better. And often people start off, I mean, we're pretty sneaky. We're willing to, you know, do whatever it takes. We do use guilt a lot. And, you know, we'll do things like, we'll just say to you know, people who potentially could invest, you know, why don't you just come by and do a little sort of 15, 20-minute chat with some of the local startups. They could really benefit from meeting you. And of course, what happens is the person shows up and falls in love with the companies and falls in love with one specific company and leaves having written a check. So the old adage about, you know, if you want money, ask for advice really does come to play. And then, of course, once somebody becomes, you know, starts to do some early stage investing, then they tend to want to do more. They bring their friends along, you know, so it really does kind of grow from there. But you really need those kind of 3 or 4, 5 initial people who are already acting as angels and say, is there anyone else you know who you could tap who might want to come out when you come out to meet some of the companies next time? So, you know, really, you know, we're fairly subtle.
So when you say 83%, 87%, I'm not sure the exact number, 5-year retention, are those retained companies in your area, or are they just they're still in business, but they may be wherever in the world.
Yeah, I mean, at this point in time, most of the companies stay in our area. And that's survivability. So they're still in business. Now, not all of them are booming, right? Not all of them, but they're still in business.
Thank you.
In some of the materials you had, you mentioned collision days.
Yes.
Where you have larger companies and the large companies share what they're interested in to help stimulate ideas and other things. Do they ever fund any of the startups?
They do.
What percentage would you say?
I don't know about, it wouldn't be a huge percentage. But yeah, we do run collision days where it's again about putting large strategic partners in front of startups, and it not only is Google and Cisco, but it's also our big insurance companies. Our community is like the insurance capital of Canada, so we've got lots of big insurance companies, and so putting startups in front of them is something that also has been successful.
Without the microphone, I know my voice carries.
You got jump-started with government 15 years ago. How easy is it to deal with your government now?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Well, you talked about how government stepped up 15 years ago to help you do some things about creating this particular universe. You talk about $1 invested and $4 returned. How easy is it to get your government's attention now and get them to be even more aggressively supporting you than they did in the past?
Well, actually, obviously I was misleading. The government actually played no role in our activities until about 5 years ago. So, we were not a legitimate, viable strategy back then. In fact, my board had a policy where we would not take any government money because we didn't want to be the B of anyone. So it was really important that we, for, by, and of was really the doctrine. We pooled money together. I mean, basically, when we were started, we were very much a co-op, right? So everybody throw money into a pot. We're going to be able to do remarkable things. We're going to be, from a rent sharing perspective, we're going to be able to decrease the costs of some of the things that we need to do individually because we're going to be doing them as a collective. And I think that kind of, that's why we're called Communitech. Some people call it Communitech, which is the Communist Technology Association of Soviet Union. But no, we're Communitech, and the word comes from the notion of it's a community of technology entrepreneurs.
So, one more question?
I guess it's the...
Gentleman in the back.
Thank you. In Connecticut, there are a lot of incubators as well as startup weekends, and many college students actually try to engage in entrepreneurship, and many schools are teaching entrepreneurship. However, as you can see around in this room, those people are not really represented in this group. I think that's probably because there's a perceived and real risk in pursuing entrepreneurship. And I would like to know, what do you do or what do you suggest young people to pursue this course of entrepreneurship? Do you have any recommendation? Do you do anything? Do you implement anything like that?
We do. So we're in every high school in Waterloo Region. We connect with 20,000 kids. We got something called Science Superheroes. We run conferences, events. We're trying to undo the damage that parents and teachers do to their children. Basically, because I'm a parent, and so what you want to do is you want to reduce risk, right? And there's even this thing called smart risk in Canada, which is just insane. It's like, don't ride your bike, stay in the bubble. It's basically what they tell you people. So, but the point is that as parents, teachers are guidance counselors or guidance counselors. There's lots of, I'm sure everyone here has a joke about guidance counselors, but certainly teachers are in a very, very closed environment. They're in a classroom where the door is closed every day. They're really not familiar with what's happening in the world. And of course, parents are obsessed with risk. And so, you can say to your child, go and do your BA at whatever, and then you do your law degree, and then you article, and you become a lawyer, and then you become a partner, and then you retire to Florida, and then you die. And it's an absolute cradle to grave. There's no risk. And so, we certainly can't count on parents teaching kids. There's a country and western song, Mama, don't let your baby grow up to be an entrepreneur. And so we can't count on parents, and so we have to go directly. And I think that, I mean, I think there's a lot of great popular culture out there. I mean, there's lots of great movies. I mean, I think that the Facebook movie changed a lot of people's opinions about the idea of being an entrepreneur when they saw how sexy it was. Ghostbusters, the greatest entrepreneurial movie ever. We had an entrepreneur film festival. There's a movie called Pirates of Silicon Valley, Startup.com. And we would play those. We still play them all the time. I've seen Startup.com 1,000 times. So there's lots of different ways that you can kind of popularize these things, but making them sexy. I mean, in Canada, it's like do something there there's zero risk, or be a hockey player where the odds are like you're never going to make it. 50 new hockey players into the NHL each year playing. Your odds are better with a venture-backed startup than making it to the NHL. But setting that aside, really is a risk. We are a very conservative, risk-averse culture in Canada. Yep.
So, like, as a community, like, how do you reduce that risk? There is you just mentioned about more perceived risk, but how can you realistically reduce any kind of a risk for, you mentioned about no startup left behind, right? No company left behind.
Yep.
How can you actually reduce the risk of, startups from being failing?
By making the investments in programs and services. We've got 9 entrepreneurs in residence that coach 600 active startups right now. We have 9 analysts who work hands-on, helping the companies. We're there. We're there to make sure they're successful, and so we work very hard for people to know that they're not alone. They're gonna be able to connect with coaches and advisors. We're gonna hook them up with their other peers. We're going to hook them up with, mock advisory boards. You're never alone. And I think the other thing about co-location and space is that, when you're doing your startup and you're surrounded by a bunch of other startups, it's a really powerful thing. Not for people who are doing their 3rd startup, but especially for young people when they're doing their 1st startup. It's really important that they're surrounded by a peer group of other people. And then what will end up happening, of course, is that on the university campuses themselves, the one person will say, hey, did you hear that Tim is doing that startup thing and it's going really well? And they'll go like, Tim was like the stupidest guy in the class. And if he can do it, imagine what we can do. Yeah. And so there will be a tipping point. I mean, we worked for years to try and get people to do a startup in university. And this one kid showed up, his name was Steve Black, and we were all like waiting for him. And he came in, we were like, we've been waiting for you. And he's like, this is creepy. But, it was true. We'd been waiting for him. We'd done so much to promote. We were on campus, and you're in universities, and, right? Everything we possibly could think of. And then finally he came, and then everybody turned and looked at Steve and said, if Steve can do it, I can do it. And then all of a sudden there was a tipping point, and now we got a wave, where entrepreneurialism is the new black. And I'm sure it's here at UConn, which is actually a territory in Canada, UConn. And places like Yale. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of startup activity that people aren't even aware of because it's underground.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.